The phone rang after midnight. One sentence, then silence. Tony Delucci had taken Bumpy's wife, belly showing. Harlem waited for Gunfire, but Bumpy only lit a cigarette and listened. The phone rang after midnight, and the man on the line didn't bother with greetings. "Mr. Johnson, it's your home. Your lady, she ain't here." Bumpy stood at his window with the city spread out below him like a dark ocean. The street lamps cut thin gold lines through Harlem, but none of that light reached his face. He held the receiver the way a judge holds a decision, steady, without haste. "Say it clean," he said. A breath. Fear, trying to behave. A car pulled up. Two men. One had a smile like he was doing a favor. They said a name. Tony Delucci. They said you'd understand. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't curse. He didn't slam anything. He just listened until the silence on the line started begging to be filled. "Is she hurt?" he asked. "I don't know. They took her quick." "She was." The man swallowed. "She was." The man swallowed. "She was showing, Mr. Johnson." That part sat in the room like a loaded pistol left on a table. Pregnant. Visible. Not just a kidnapping, an announcement. A message meant for the whole neighborhood, not just one man. Outside, somewhere in the building, a radio played low. A laugh drifted up from the street, then died. Harlem didn't know yet, but it was about to. Bumpy set the receiver down gently, like it might crack if treated rough. He reached for a cigarette, tapped it once, and lit it without looking for the flame. The ember found him anyway. Most men, at that moment, would have reached for iron, would have sent boys running, would have turned Harlem into a drumbeat of footsteps and gunmetal. Bumpy didn't. He stood there, smoke curling around his knuckles, and let the insult fully settle into place, because he wanted to feel exactly what Delucci wanted him to feel. Fear. And then he watched it pass through him and find no home. He turned from the window and spoke to the room. Not loud, not dramatic. "Wake who needs waking," he said, quietly. A pause. "And nobody moves on anger." In Harlem, anger was easy. Anybody could spill it. Bumpy Johnson built power the other way, by choosing the moment, and somewhere out there, Tony Delucci was counting on violence. Bumpy let him count. Morning came careful, like it had heard the news before the people did. Harlem's sky was pale and cold, and the street looked the same as any other until you watched the eyes. Men stood longer on corners. Women held their packages tighter. Shopkeepers opened their gates without the usual talk, as if sound might invite trouble. The whisper moved first, sliding from stoop to stoop, from barber chair to church steps. Bumpy's wife was gone. Taken. Not lost. Taken. And she was carrying his child. By 9, every block had its own version of the story, and every version ended the same way. Blood. Folks expected the streets to light up with gunfire, expected cars to roll slow with curtains drawn, expected young men to get brave on borrowed nerves. Instead, Bumpy Johnson walked, no entourage announcing him, no hurry betraying him. He moved down Lenox with his coat buttoned, his hat low, and his hands empty. But the emptiness wasn't weakness. It was a message. I am not chasing. I am arriving. He stopped at a fruit stand where the owner had served his mother years ago. The old man's fingers trembled over the apples. "You eat," Bumpy said, selecting one and paying more than it cost. "Keep your head." A few steps later, he nodded to a numbers runner who looked ready to bolt. "Today you mind your mouth," Bumpy told him. "You hear something, you bring it to me, not to the sidewalk." The runner swallowed. "Yes, sir." At the barber shop, the clippers were on, but nobody was laughing. Bumpy stepped inside, the room quieting the way a room quiets for a hymn. He didn't demand names. He didn't threaten. He let the air settle, then spoke like a man placing a hand on a shoulder. "This neighborhood ain't a playground," he said. "No loose talk. No hero business. If you're loyal, prove it by staying steady." The young fellow by the door shifted, itching for action. Bumpy looked at him once. Just once. And the itch turned to shame. Outside, a patrolman watched from across the street, curious, cautious. Bumpy met his gaze and didn't blink. The law had its badge. Harlem had its own order. And Bumpy carried it without showing it. He went on, checking doors, speaking to elders, letting mothers see his face. He did not promise safety. He promised attention, which was rarer. By noon, Harlem understood something that sounded like relief and felt like dread. Bumpy was not hunting wild. He was building a circle. And inside that circle, time belonged to him still. The first hour after noon felt like a dare. Harlem's tongue kept working. Every corner had a new detail. Every detail sharpened into prophecy. Delucci wants ransom. Delucci wants a headline. Delucci wants Bumpy in a rage. The stories weren't meant to be true. They were meant to spread. Bumpy let them spread. He sat in a quiet room behind a respectable door, where the air smelled of coffee and old paper, and men spoke only when spoken to. There was no map on the table, no pistol laid out for comfort, only a ledger, a pen, and the patience of a man who understood that time cuts both ways. "They think the clock belongs to them," one of his people said, voice tight. Bumpy didn't answer that. He turned a page in the ledger, slow as a priest. Names. Deaths. Promises. Favors owed from years when Harlem was poorer and hungrier, when a kind word had been worth more than cash. "Send word to Miss Etta at the beauty parlor," he said. "If a strange car idles twice, I want the plate remembered." A nod. Quiet feet leaving. "Tell Deacon Price I need him walking." Bumpy went on. "Church steps see more than they admit." Another nod. "And the dock foreman, tell him I'm calling in what he owes. If Delucci's men touch the river, I want to hear the splash before it happens." The room listened, not because they feared him, but because they trusted the way he moved, like a man placing weights on a scale until the truth had to tip. Outside, Delucci's game kept playing. A messenger drifted through a bar with a grin too sharp, letting a hint fall into a drink. 48 hours. As if a number could make a king kneel, as if Harlem would watch its own law get laughed at. By dusk, Bumpy walked again. Not to hunt, only to be seen. He stopped at a storefront, where an old woman swept her step like she was sweeping worry away. "Mr. Johnson," she said, eyes wet but proud, "they trying to shame you." Bumpy looked down at the broom, then at her hands. "Shame don't live here," he told her, "not if we keep our backs straight." He didn't raise his voice. That was the point. The street leaned in, and the street heard him. That night, the circle tightened. A bartender whispered of a new face, buying rounds with nervous generosity. A cabman spoke of a fare paid in silence, heading north with curtains drawn. A man who owed Bumpy his freedom arrived with a scrap of information and shaking hands. Bumpy took it, calm as winter. He wrote one address on a torn matchbook, folded it twice, and passed it across the table. "No shouting," he said. "Just footsteps. Bring me man shadow first." He did not rush to the door. He did not announce a war. He simply nodded once, and the city, his city, began to point. By the second night, the kidnapping wasn't a secret anymore. It was theatre. A note appeared where it was meant to be found, tucked beneath a glass on a backroom table, slid across a counter with a smile too bold. Tony Delucci wanted it that way. He wanted Harlem to hear his name and think of Bumpy Johnson as a man being tested. Men on the avenue took positions without being told. Young ones, hungry for permission. Old ones, tired of funerals. Every face asked the same question. How long before Bumpy answers with gunfire? Bumpy answered by walking into a crowded room and sitting down. It was a social club that belonged to the neighborhood, not to noise. Cards on the table. Coffee on the stove. When Bumpy entered, conversation folded itself and put its hands in its lap. He didn't announce the trouble. He didn't paint grief across his face. He nodded to the elders first, then to the men who watched the door, and he took a chair where everyone could see him. "Harlem is not a battlefield," he said. "Only that. No sermon. No heat." The sentence landed like a rule carved into stone. A man near the wall cleared his throat, brave enough to speak. "They took your family, Bump. Folks saying we look weak." Bumpy looked at him the way a father looks at a son holding a match. "Weak is burning your own house to scare a thief," he said. Silence. Even the cards stopped moving. He leaned back, hands open, as if showing there was nothing hidden. "No shooting into streets where children sleep," he went on. "No kicking in doors that belong to people who never raised a hand against us. Anybody who can't hold his temper can hold it somewhere else." The men who came in hungry for war felt their stomachs turn. Not from fear, from respect. Bumpy's voice did not swell, but the room obeyed it. Outside, Delucci's message kept spreading. A rumor said Delucci had friends downtown. Another said there'd be a body by morning if Bumpy didn't pay. Every rumor was bait. Bumpy refused to bite. He knew panic would widen the wound. Discipline would keep Harlem from paying tonight again. Instead, he made calls that sounded like courtesy and moved like a knife. The butcher on 135th was told not to sell on credit to certain faces. The landlord who held rooms for out-of-town cousins was reminded of who kept the trouble away. A truck driver who liked Delucci's money found his route delayed, then delayed again, until patience turned sour. By dawn, Delucci's men were still breathing, but they were uncomfortable. Their cigarettes tasted wrong. Their breakfasts came late. Their own people started asking questions. That was Bumpy's kind of pressure, quiet, relentless, built from the neighborhood itself. And then Delucci crossed the line that even criminals understood. He sent word through a messenger to a public place, in daylight, like he owned Harlem's respect. The boy delivered it with shaking hands, unable to meet Bumpy's eyes. It wasn't ransom. It wasn't negotiation. It was mockery. Bumpy read the message once, folded it, put it in his pocket like trash he would dispose of later. The room waited for him to break something. He stood, straightened his coat, and looked around at the faces that trusted him with their peace. "Tell everybody," he said softly. "This won't be settled loud." He paused at the door, the weight of the whole block hanging on his back. "But it will be settled," he added. Then he stepped into the morning, calm as a man walking to a promise. Night did not bring rest. It brought visitors tonight. Bumpy waited in a back office, where the lamp made a small island of light, and the rest of the room stayed in shadow. One by one, men arrived who did not come to Harlem unless the weather turned dangerous. Their shoes were clean, their hats expensive, their eyes trained to measure exits. They spoke with downtown certainty, the kind that assumes the world will bend before it has to break. But they did not sit until Bumpy nodded. "Delucci has made this loud," the first one said. "People are talking." Bumpy watched him without heat. "People always talk," he said. "Only fools think talk is control." The second man offered a thin smile. "Tony is not a fool." Bumpy took a slow drag and let the smoke choose its own path. "Then he's choosing something worse," he said. They had come to bargain, on behalf of order, on behalf of business, on behalf of the invisible hands that moved money between neighborhoods. They did not mention his wife by name. They did not mention the child. In their world, tenderness was a weakness to hide. Bumpy did not hide it. He did not display it either. He carried it like an oath. He opened the matchbook in his palm. The address was there, written plain. He slid it across the desk. "Your man's been using a room off Tremont," he said. "2 doors from a bakery. A woman upstairs with children. He chose that place because he thinks I won't disturb it." The men exchanged a glance. Not surprise, recognition. They knew the address. They knew the foolishness of dragging Harlem's name into a building that still smelled of bread. "What do you want?" the first asked, softer now. Bumpy leaned forward, voice low enough that Power had to come closer to hear it. "I want her back before the next sunrise," he said. "And I want Tony to understand he has borrowed fear he cannot repay." The second man's smile vanished. "If you move wrong, this becomes a problem." Bumpy's eyes stayed steady. "It is already a problem," he replied. "The only question is whether it ends with decency or with a lesson." When they left, the room felt colder. Bumpy stood alone a moment, listening to the building settle. There was no tremble in his hands. He called his people in, gave instructions like prayer, quiet, precise, merciful in their boundaries. "No shots," he said. "No shouting. Bring my wife home." Across town, in rooms where men counted trouble like currency, Tony Delucci began to feel the air change because the fear he meant for Harlem had climbed back up the ladder and found his own throat. Harlem didn't celebrate with fireworks. It wasn't that kind of victory. When word spread that she was home, alive, steady on her feet, wrapped in a coat that still smelled like someone else's car, the neighborhood didn't pour into the streets. It did something quieter. Windows stayed lit a little longer. Mothers loosened their shoulders. Men who had been gripping anger like a weapon finally let their hands unclench. Bumpy didn't let anybody gather at his door. No congratulations. No handshakes. No young men looking for a story to carry. Inside, he kept the lamps low. He sat his wife down at the table, poured her water, and watched her drink. His eyes did most of the asking. "They didn't touch me," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the thin edge of a thing endured. Bumpy nodded once. Not relief, acknowledgement. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his palm. Warm, certain. "Harlem is still Harlem," he told her. "That's what matters." Later, when she slept, Bumpy moved through the house like a man checking locks that weren't only on doors. He spoke to the doctor in a whisper. He spoke to the women who watched over the block in softer ways than men ever learned. He made sure the child was still safe, not with prayers shouted to a ceiling, but with arrangements that held. By morning, the neighborhood was already rewriting the story in its own language. Some said Bumpy had sent killers, others said he'd paid a fortune. People needed noise to explain a result. They couldn't understand a man who could bend outcomes without breaking the streets. Bumpy didn't correct them. He went out and did what he always did when Harlem was threatened. He restored order. He visited the shopkeepers first, leaving money where fear had been. He spoke to the elders like they were partners, not spectators. He looked the boys in the eye and reminded them that real strength wasn't in pulling a trigger. "It's in knowing when not to," he said. And somewhere, far from Harlem's warmth, Tony Delucci learned the cost of borrowing another man's name. He wasn't turned into a spectacle. He wasn't made into a legend. He was made into a legend. He was made into a warning. Years later, when people spoke of Bumpy Johnson, they didn't talk first about the violence. They talked about the restraint, about the way he protected his own without turning the neighborhood into a graveyard. Because legacy isn't built on noise. It's built on what you refuse to do and what you always bring home.